Mr. Auerbach. I will be your science teacher today on video. So, those of you that were not here in class today will remember that last week we talked about this stuff, evidence for evolution that is telling us about common ancestry. And just really quickly, since this is the screen I started out on, we talked about how bone structure between various species can show that they have a common ancestor in this ancient lobe-finned fish, because we see the same skeletal structures across almost all four-limbed animals, including ourselves. And that tells us that we all share a common ancestor, because evolution never starts over with a new bone structure. It just changes the one that exists. And that is one important lesson to learn that is featured in 17.4, which is what we're talking about today. The other thing was vestigial structures. Here, what they're showing you in this picture is this leg of a snake, a vestige of when snakes had legs, of which there are other things too. Like here is, if you look closely here under Basilosaurus, which is an ancestor of the whale, modern whales and dolphins, it has a vestige of when it was a land animal. A lot of people don't know this, so this is new, but this ancient Aerodactyl was an animal that lived, we suspect, like a lot of things that become aquatic, lived near the water, and either it was going into the water to look for prey, or it was going into the water to get away from predators. We don't really know. But we know that this thing started to spend more and more time in water, and at some point, its ancestors began to change the way their legs were, eventually really starting to lose those feet to a flipper situation, even though the bones inside are still the same bones that we have in our bodies now. But you can see that it had a hip, which is how we discovered, because whales have a hip also, which they don't need. And so you can see it here. It's this little thing down at the bottom of this inset picture that shows how the whales used to have a hip, but now they don't. It's a vestige now that still is programmed into the DNA, but you'll notice it's not even attached to the spine, the backbone anymore, and so it's just vestigial. It doesn't do any work. But it does show that there's common ancestry with earlier land-walking mammals, which was a huge discovery for us. And again, talking about evidence of evolution, evidence of common ancestry is evidence of evolution. Okay, so we've talked about those two things. Those are mostly review. Here's a new one though, embryology and development. I just realized that I need to bring up a picture. Sorry, I had it open before, but I closed it foolishly, and I'm going to show you this picture. Embryology is another proof of evolution. I'll use this picture. Let's open this in another tab so that it's... Oh, okay. We'll have to go with this. So what you see here, the bottom row are different animals, and I know that it's kind of fuzzy, but here we have a human, it's a rabbit, a cat, a pig, a chick, a tortoise, and a salamander. And above them are their earlier stages of development as embryos. So in other words, maybe this is a human, I can't read it, chimp maybe, whatever it is, it starts as this, and then it becomes this, and then it becomes this. And whether it's a tortoise, or a chick, or a pig, or a cat, or a rabbit, or maybe a human, I can't tell, we all start out looking like fish or salamander embryos, don't we? And that's because the embryonic development is a computer program, or it's a program that the DNA has in itself. First you add this, then you add this, then you add this, then you add this, right? And we can see our evolutionary history in embryos because the instructions have changed, but you can see the starting point is the same. The starting point for all of these things that become all of these different animals is very, very similar. And in fact, we go through a lot of the evolutionary past during our embryological development. We actually have a period of time where in utero we have gill slits from where we used to have gills. We have a tail that gets elongated and then shortened. And we go through all of these little stages. So it's sort of like each new step in evolution was added on to the old steps of developing the embryo. Turns out that embryonic development is where a great deal of mutation leads to vast differences in body plan. And so that is something else. We look at embryos for evidence of common ancestry because look at that first row. You couldn't tell a human embryo from a tortoise embryo very easily at all, could you? And that's because we all started as sort of the same program and just modifications as we went through. Okay, so that was one thing, embryonic development as evidence of evolution. Now, the other thing is molecular genetics. And so at the molecular code, you can see similarities in organisms based on how closely related they are. We only share about 20% ancestry.
Kurt Johnson, if you're in the building, please call extension 3404. Kurt Johnson, extension 3404. Thank you.
Where were we? If you look at the genetic code of different organisms, you can see that the more closely related they are, the more similar they are. Let me look this up because, again, I'm sorry, oops, hemo. Okay, hopefully we're going to come up with a good, here we go. Okay, how about this? In this one, we're going to compare amino acid sequences for different organisms. Let's see if this picture opens up nicely. No, it does not. Let's try this one. Okay, yeah, here we go. Let's open this in another tab. So this looks super complicated, but it's not. This is the amino acid sequence for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 different organisms, and they're listed in just about their order of relationship to us, right? Humans are right under us with chimpanzees are right under humans, and then cows and dogs and mice, and we're approximately most to least distant from us on this list. Like zebrafish are the most distant from us. And the thing is, this list is all the first letter of amino acid names, like tyrosine, glutamate, all so forth and so on, all the different amino acids. And what they're showing is the about 25 or 40 amino acids that go into a particular protein, and I don't know what it is, but they're showing that the farther on you go from us, the less similarities there are. Like if you look at these two rows between humans and chimps, you have a lot of identical stuff, right? T, T, G, G, M, M. So in the same place, they all have the same stuff. Whereas if you look at something farther away, like the chicken, for example, our first one is T, whereas the chicken's is E. Then we share the G, but we go with M, and chicken has L, whereas chimpanzee and human are very, very similar. You might go through this and find one or two differences in the whole protein, whereas if you go through this for something very different from us, you'll find many more differences. Look, almost every one of these that we look at is going to have a difference between the human version and the zebra and pufferfish versions. And so that's molecular evolution. The more distantly related we are, the less we have in common, because mutation changes DNA over time. So as two things split on the evolutionary map here, the more distant they get, the more distances will develop. between them. And so it makes sense that we would have more in common with a chimpanzee than we do with a mouse, and more in common with a mouse than we do with a zebrafish, and more in common with any of them than we do with, say, a banana, right? We still share about 20 to 30% of our DNA, or maybe even as much as 60 with bananas. But we'll talk about that tomorrow, because we're going to do a short paper lab related to this. Okay, so those are the two new ideas that we talked about today, and thank you very much for your attention. I am Mr. Auerbach, and I will be your science teacher tomorrow.